He was the king no one ever saw, the ghost who outlived every rival and every raid. But when silence became his final weapon, the world was left to wonder, did El Mayo vanish, or did he win? They call him the invisible Godfather, not because he hides in the shadows, but because he became the shadows. Governments have chased ghosts for decades. Task forces formed, borders locked down, millions spent. But Ismael Zambada Garcia, he never once heard the clang of a prison door, not even for a single night. Not one courtroom photo, not one leaked booking sheet. Just rumors, blurred glimpses, and the kind of silence that terrifies the men who hunt monsters. He was not loud, never flashy, no tigers on chains, no gold-plated guns. While others posed for the cameras or bought songs in their name, El Mayo did the opposite. He evaporated. No social media, no press, no viral tales of shootouts. Only stories passed mouth to mouth like a prayer or a warning. He didn't need theatrics. He built empires out of restraint. What makes a man untouchable? Not just power, not just wealth. It's patience. It's knowing that pride gets you killed faster than bullets. While the world chased El Chapo and sang ballads about El Azul, Mayo learned to become absence. He never needed to be seen to be felt. A whisper of his name was enough to change votes, move borders, make soldiers flinch. There are agents who have chased him for over 30 years. They retire before catching even a glimpse. Some believe he's dead. Others think he cut a deal. But the drugs still flow. The money still moves. The violence still pauses when he lifts a finger. So if he is gone, his ghost is still working overtime. In Sinaloa, he's a myth woven into the soil. They say he walks with farmers and drinks coffee with old men under mango trees. They say his eyes miss nothing, that he knows before you know. But those are just stories, right? Maybe. Or maybe that's exactly how he built it. No fingerprints, no camera flashes, no courtrooms, just the legend of the man who never got caught because he never let himself be found. And now, as you drift toward sleep, remember this. Not all kings wear crowns. Some rule from silence. Some erase the road behind them as they walk. And some never leave a mugshot behind. Sinaloa, 1948. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and mango sap. Ismael Zambada Garcia was not born in a hospital. He entered the world beneath a tin roof, where the wind whispered through cracked boards and chickens scratched at the earth outside. The mountains stood like sleeping giants around the village, unmoved by the cries of another hungry child. His family didn't have much, just a patch of land, a few animals, and a will to survive. And in that silence, among the heat and humming insects, a boy began to learn that the world would not slow down for him. His first lessons weren't written in books. They came from watching his father's calloused hands work the soil, from understanding that food wasn't promised, it had to be pulled from the dirt. With aching backs and blistered palms, there were no second chances. If the harvest failed, you went hungry. If the rains didn't come, you learned to pray with cracked lips. And if opportunity came, you didn't ask questions. You took it, because nothing was owed, not to a child of the Sierra Madre. He walked barefoot down dusty trails before he ever saw a paved road. He helped gather mangoes and tend to goats long before he learned to read. But he watched, listened, understood. There was a rhythm to the land and a sharper rhythm to those who moved things in secret. Trucks that rumbled through the hills late at night. Quiet conversations over coffee. Men who came with nothing and left with gold chains. The seeds of something darker were always present, hidden just beneath the orchards. Mayo didn't grow up dreaming of empires. He dreamed of enough food, enough peace, enough power to never bow again. He learned young that fear could be currency. That respect wasn't given, it was carved. And that silence was armor. He wasn't the biggest or the loudest, but he watched how people bent around certain names. He saw who the police avoided, who the elders deferred to, and more than anything else, he saw that the most dangerous men were the quiet ones, So while other boys chased girls or drank beneath the stars, Ismael Zambada was learning how the invisible ruled the world, not through headlines, but through hunger, favor, and timing. The land taught him that. The orchards gave him patience, the dust gave him grit, and somewhere between those mango trees and the sleeping mountains, a king was beginning to form, not in gold, but in silence. Before he was a kingpin, before his name ever reached Washington, young Ismael Zambada was just a boy guiding burros through the veins of the Sierra Madre. The air up there was thin and full of secrets. Dust clung to your skin like a second coat. The sun cracked the earth, and the trees leaned heavy with silence. But those who knew how to move through the mountains knew how to survive, and how to make things move that weren't supposed to. Ismael was barely a teenager when he took his first real job. Not the kind you brag about, the kind whispered into your ear behind a cantina or handed down through a cousin with connections. It didn't involve bank accounts or office desks. It involved sacks slung over mules, trails so narrow you could fall with one wrong step, and the understanding that if someone caught you, you weren't coming back. It wasn't about the money. There wasn't much of that at first. What mattered was proving you could be trusted, that you didn't talk, that you didn't ask stupid questions, that you showed up, did the job, and kept your mouth shut after. Ismael learned early that trust was worth more than silver, that being useful was how you bought time in a world that didn't hand out lifelines. He rode through the night, guided only by moonlight and the sound of hooves against rock. Sometimes the bags were filled with dried poppy resin, other times with cash. Once, it was weapons. He didn't need to know where it was going. He just needed to know the route and when not to be seen. And every time he came back in one piece, someone new gave him another route, another chance, another test. Each journey taught him something: how to listen to the hills, how to read a soldier's eyes at a checkpoint, how to know when someone was lying by the way they exhaled. The mountains weren't just terrain, they were a classroom. And Ismael, he was an honors student. He didn't rush. He didn't try to jump the line. He watched the older men, the ones who never raised their voices but always had the last word. He noticed who others feared when they entered a room. He studied them like a chessboard. And slowly, with each quiet delivery, with each nod of approval, he stepped deeper into a world built on risk and silence. The dirt roads of the Sierra Madre did more than carry goods. They carved out futures, and for the boy named Ismael, they were already beginning to shape a legend. Before cocaine ever touched his hands, before his name ever echoed in courtrooms or black site briefings, Ismael Zambada learned how to make flowers bleed, not the pretty kind sold in city squares. These were poppies, thick-stemmed, sun-fed, and carved with knives that didn't tremble. In the highlands of Sinaloa, poppies were more than crops. They were currency. They were war. They were the future. It started with latex, the milky sap that leaked from scored pods. At first, Ismael just helped gather it. Hands stained, eyes sharp, moving from row to row with the quiet rhythm of someone who understood this was not farming, it was survival. There were no irrigation systems, no government subsidies, just fields hidden between canyons, guarded by silence and the occasional rifle. He watched how the resin was dried into bricks, watched how it was weighed, packed, and passed from hand to hand with nods instead of signatures. Everything was unspoken. Everyone understood the risk. And even as a young man, Ismael could see the outline of something bigger in the way these small transactions connected villages to cities, cities to borders, and borders to power. The Americans were already pouring money into the so-called war on drugs. Planes sprayed poison from above, trying to kill the fields. But for every patch burned, 2 more grew. It wasn't just a business, it was defiance. The government sent soldiers, the land sent flowers, and Ismael? He began learning how to turn that defiance into empire. Poppies were not glamorous. They didn't carry the same shine as cocaine or meth, but they were steady. They fed families, They built roads the state had forgotten. And in those mountains, the man who would one day become El Mayo started weaving his own network, not of addicts, but of loyalty. Farmers, couriers, cooks, and chemists. Everyone had a role. Everyone had a stake. And everyone knew who made it possible. He didn't rush the rise. He let it bloom like the fields themselves, season by season, step by step. While others got greedy, Ismael got patient. While others tried to be kings overnight, he stayed in the dirt, learning every layer of the system. Not just how to grow opium, but how to make it move, how to hide it, how to protect it. It was never just about drugs. It was about structure. About learning how to build something so deeply rooted that no storm could tear it down. And long before the world ever called him a drug lord, Ismael Zambada was already a farmer. A farmer who planted seeds not just in soil, but in people. Seeds that would one day grow into a cartel, a federation, a legacy written not in ink, but in blood. They called him a rancher because he had cattle. They called him a trafficker because things moved through the hills when he gave the word. And they called him a ghost because no one could ever find him. Not really. But none of those names fit the way he did things. Ismael Zambada was never just one thing. He was the sum of 1,000 silent calculations, each one made far from the noise, far from the cameras, far from the blood that soaked so many others too fast, too soon. He still dressed like a farmer, still wore boots caked with real mud, still tipped his hat to elders and paid for coffee in quiet corner cafes when he passed through town. But behind the softness, something sharp was growing. He wasn't just harvesting poppies anymore. He was harvesting people, connections, paths, promises. He knew that the real power didn't come from fear. It came from structure, from knowing when to step forward and when to vanish. As the money grew, so did the weight of his name, not shouted, never broadcast, just murmured behind closed doors. That's Mayo's territory. That shipment has his protection. Careful, he's connected to him. And somehow, without ever holding a press conference or firing a shot in public, Mayo was becoming the man everyone wanted to know but no one wanted to cross. He didn't bark orders. He didn't need to. He listened more than he spoke, and when he finally did speak, people didn't just hear it, they followed it. His soldiers called him Jefe. His allies called him Viejo. But in the hills of Sinaloa, they were beginning to call him something else. The General. It wasn't a military title. It was something older than that. Something tribal. A recognition that this man could coordinate not just convoys, but entire corridors. That he didn't just think about shipments. He thought about seasons, about elections, about weather, about which generals were honest this year and which ones were looking for bribes. While younger traffickers showed off cars and houses, Mayo built an invisible fortress of favors. His wealth didn't glitter, it moved. Through hands, through towns, through institutions. And the beauty of it was that if you took away one piece, the rest kept working. Like a true general, he didn't tie everything to himself. He built a system that could breathe without him, even as it obeyed him. He never stopped being a farmer, but he stopped farming land. He started farming power, quietly, carefully, like planting something that you know will outlive you. And the dirt beneath his boots? It wasn't just earth anymore. It was the foundation of something vast, something that would one day swallow cities. Before the newspapers ever called it a cartel, before the courtrooms ever named it an empire, there was just a network of men, roots, and understanding. And at the center of it all, quiet, steady, calculating, was Ismael Zambada. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the most feared, but he was the one who saw the future before anyone else dared to imagine it. The old way of doing things was chaos. Rival clans cutting throats over muddy trails. Bribes paid twice because no one trusted the first handshake. Men killed not for profit, but for pride. It was blood and smoke with no direction. And while others fed the fire, Mayo started drawing maps. He didn't want a gang. He wanted a structure, a federation, a system where everyone got a piece and no one stepped out of line unless they wanted to disappear. He met with the right people, not just gunmen, but businessmen, politicians, old-school smugglers, who understood that power didn't come from bullets, it came from balance. And slowly, a loose confederation began to form. Families in Sonora, crews in Durango, contacts in Jalisco, and, of course, the rising name of Joaquin Guzman, better known as El Chapo. It wasn't friendship that bound them. It was math. It was profit. It was the unspoken truth that they could all make more money together than bleeding each other dry. And it worked. Not because it was perfect, but because Mayo knew how to hold it together. When tempers flared, he smoothed them. When someone got greedy, he cut them off quietly. When blood was needed, he sent the right message, once, and didn't repeat himself. He didn't wear the crown. He didn't build a palace. He stayed in the hills, on his ranch, where the dust felt like home and the silence worked in his favor. But through radio calls, coded messages, and middlemen who never said his name twice, he held together something far larger than anyone could see on a map. The world would later call it the Sinaloa Cartel. The DEA would call it the most powerful drug trafficking organization on Earth. But to the men who built it, it was just the Federation. And to the men who held it together, there was only one real architect. He didn't need credit. He didn't chase headlines. He chased longevity. And in a world where most bosses die in shootouts or rot in cells, Mayo was already playing a different game. Not for today, but for decades. The others built kingdoms that could fall. He built a machine that could keep running even in the dark. And the machine had no name, just a pulse, a rhythm, and the quiet voice of the farmer who became its father. As Colombian routes shift north, Mayo helps weave a tapestry of alliances that births the Sinaloa Cartel. In the world Mayo was building, no one moved alone. You couldn't. Not if you wanted to last. Not if you wanted more than a fleeting empire soaked in headlines and blood. He knew alliances were more powerful than armies. And so he chose his partners with care, not just for their muscle, but for their minds, their reach, and their silence. With Joaquin Guzman, the man the world would come to know as El Chapo, Mayo found energy, ambition, a wildfire with legs. Chapo didn't think small. He wanted tunnels, planes, whole cities bent beneath his will. He was younger, louder, and far more reckless. But Mayo knew how to harness that. He didn't try to tame the flame. He built fire breaks around it, let it burn where it was useful, cut it off when it threatened too much. Then there were the Beltran Leyva brothers, Arturo, Alfredo, Hector, and Carlos, sharp, ruthless, politically connected in ways others weren't. They brought discipline and military precision to the table, but they also brought ego, heat, the kind that Mayo hated. Still, he understood their value. With them, the web stretched wider. Into Mexico City, into Guerrero, into the heart of the national security apparatus itself. Together, they weren't just moving product. They were redrawing maps. They weren't just smuggling, they were governing. Each shipment became policy, each bribe a vote, each murder a quiet law passed in blood. And through it all, Mayo stayed the calm in the storm. Not the flashiest, not the one giving interviews or posing beside gold-plated rifles, but always in the center of the web, adjusting strings as needed. There were dinners where war was averted with a nod, phone calls where entire cities changed hands without a single bullet fired. That was the kind of power they built, power you didn't see until it was too late. A federation where the lines between business, politics, and terror blurred completely. And while Chapo made headlines, and the Beltrans made enemies, Mayo made plans. He understood that real power wasn't about being feared, it was about being necessary. You couldn't kill what you depended on. And by the time anyone realized how deep his roots ran, it was already too late. He wasn't just a partner in power. He was its architect. He let others carry the crown, knowing it painted a target. He let them climb, knowing they would fall. And when they did, he was still there, in the background, always ready, always necessary, always in control. In the thick heat of the 1980s, a rumor drifted through the valleys of Sinaloa like smoke from an unseen fire. Mayo Zambada was dead, shot, betrayed, taken out in some remote canyon by rivals or by the army. The newspapers didn't print it, but the streets whispered it, and for a time, even some of his own believed it. There were no sightings, no messages, no one collecting the usual debts. It was as if he had been swallowed whole by the mountains that raised him. But he wasn't dead. He was watching, he was learning, and more than anything, he was perfecting a new skill, not how to fight, not how to smuggle, but how to vanish. Disappearing wasn't just survival, it was an art. And Mayo, always a man of patience, saw that being unseen gave him more control than any weapon ever could. Let others chase glory. Let them post pictures, sing their names into corridos, leave trails like bloodstains behind them. He would become fog, present but untouchable, whispered but never grasped. While the federales kicked down doors and kicked up dust, he was moving. Not far, never too far, just enough to keep one step ahead of the boots and helicopters. He didn't hide in caves or live underground. He stayed in plain sight on ranches, in small villages, sometimes even walking past the same checkpoints meant to catch him. But he changed the way he moved. No patterns, no routines. Only trust in those who had earned it through silence, not noise. And during that vanishing act, he studied. The way law enforcement operated, the way information leaked, the way technology was beginning to track what men once lost. He saw that power now meant staying off the grid, not flaunting your reach. So when he came back quietly, without announcement, he came back sharper, less visible, more dangerous. It would not be the last time he disappeared. It would become his signature. In the decades that followed, whenever things grew too hot, Mayo would fade again. No shootouts, no arrests, just absence, a name removed from intelligence chatter, only to resurface months later, stronger and more connected. And every time, the same question echoed: how does a man vanish so completely? The answer was simple. He never stopped being a farmer, but instead of planting seeds, he planted silence. And when things threatened to uproot him, he simply stepped into the mist and waited. Because dead men don't learn, but ghosts, they watch everything. There were no manifestos, no mission statements, no blood oath rituals or sacred texts. But anyone who worked under Mayo Zambada knew the rules, not because they were shouted, but because they were lived, quietly, rigidly, passed down from lips that didn't tremble and eyes that didn't blink. If you broke them, you didn't get a second chance. And if you followed them, you just might survive long enough to matter. The first rule was simple: don't get high on your own product. Not because it was a cliché, but because it dulled the edges. Mayo believed the business required clarity, not chaos. Drugs were to be moved, sold, controlled, not consumed. He'd seen too many young men with sharp minds lose themselves in the same powder they once moved with precision. A high boss was a dead boss. A careless soldier was a liability. So he kept his head clear, always. The second rule: don't get loud. Noise brought attention. Attention brought heat. Heat brought death. Mayo wasn't interested in being famous. He didn't need music made about him or gold-plated guns. He wore simple clothes, rode in unremarkable trucks, and stayed out of the spotlight like it was poison. Let others chase legend. He chased longevity. The third rule: never fall in love with the headlines. Whether they called you a ghost or a godfather, it didn't matter. What mattered was control. He watched men rise with the applause and fall with the flashing lights. Cameras didn't love you, they marked you. Journalists didn't celebrate you, they counted your days. Mayo read the papers, yes, but only to know who was talking too much, and when they'd likely disappear. He carved these commandments not into stone, but into memory, his and everyone around him. Even when things got bloody, even when the money grew too big to count, he never broke his own rules, and that's why he outlasted the kings who burned too bright. He had no throne, no crown, no Instagram, but he had the one thing none of the flashy ones ever kept: time. And in this game, time was the only true power. You followed the rules or you vanished. Simple as that. No exceptions. Because to Mayo, this was never about glory. It was about staying in the game, moving the pieces, and living long enough to see them all fall into place. He didn't just make rules, he became them. And that's why, long after others were dragged out in chains or left bleeding on marble floors, El Mayo kept walking, unseen, uncaught, and still, somehow, in control. In the hills where the government's reach runs thin and the promises of politicians vanish like morning mist, Ismael Zambada built something more durable than fear. He didn't just run a cartel, he built an ecosystem, a shadow state, one that paved roads, paid salaries, and stitched together the parts of Mexico the official state had long forgotten. He understood something most never grasped, that true power doesn't come from taking, it comes from giving, from making yourself necessary. In villages tucked deep in the Sierra Madre, it wasn't the mayor who got things done, it was El Mayo. Need a bridge fixed after the rains? He'd send men. Need a school built where children had been sitting under trees for years? Cement would arrive, quietly. No speeches, just action. He paid teachers when the checks from the capital stopped coming. He funded clinics, not because he had to, but because it bought something even more valuable than loyalty. It bought silence, grateful silence, protective silence, the kind that made it impossible for strangers to ask too many questions, or for outsiders to get too close. He hired engineers and builders, not just gunmen. Put fathers to work laying down asphalt where the government had left nothing but mud. His money didn't just build houses, it built dependency. A world where his presence meant electricity, groceries, jobs, where his absence meant hardship. That's how he became more than a trafficker. That's how he became necessary. And unlike the state, he delivered fast. No paperwork, no permits, no votes required, just results. His version of governance was stripped of bureaucracy and padded with fear. But in places where no help ever came, that fear felt like protection. The roads he built weren't just for kindness. They were arteries, paths to move product, yes, but also paths to move influence. Every favor was a thread, and soon, those threads became a web. Not just in Sinaloa, but beyond. The borderlands, the coast, the jungle. Everywhere the state faltered, Mayo stepped in, not with promises, with presence. They called it a cartel because it sold drugs. But inside, it was more than that. It was a machine with rules, responsibilities, and reach. A parallel government. One that didn't hold elections but held everything else. And in the heart of that machine, one man, dressed like a farmer, made decisions that rippled across continents. Not from a throne but from a plastic chair, under a tree, while sipping coffee in a place maps barely marked. He didn't need to be called president. He just needed to be the reason the town still had lights when night fell. And in that quiet, in that darkness, his power only grew. When bodies fell in the dust, the headlines searched for El Chapo, for the Beltrons, for the hot-blooded men who left trails and bragged in whispers. But deep down, in the quiet rooms where truth hides behind respect and fear, everyone knew whose will had been done. Mayo Zambada didn't need to pull the trigger. He didn't need to be seen near the smoke. His fingerprints never touched the steel, but his silence always echoed louder than the gunfire. That was his way. He didn't rush revenge. He cultivated it. let it mature like a harvest, waited until the moment was invisible but perfect. His enemies often died not during the fight, but after they thought the storm had passed, months later, sometimes years. A flat tire on a mountain road, a missing truck, a knock on a door that led to nowhere. And behind every one of those deaths, people whispered the same thing. It had to be Mayo. Not because they saw him, but because they didn't. Violence under his watch wasn't chaos, it was choreography, calculated, clean, purposeful. He didn't kill for reputation. He killed for balance, for message, and always with distance. Always with deniability so strong that even the prosecutors stopped trying to find the knife. They only searched for the shadow that gave the order. His men were not loud. They didn't spray bullets for fame. They were patient, loyal. Most of them never met him, just followed the line of command, like a river guided by gravity. A system of control that needed no shouting, just structure, just presence. And the fear? It didn't come from the violence. It came from the quiet. From knowing that if Mayo wanted you gone, there would be no warning, no explosion, no spectacle. Just absence. You'd be erased like chalk on stone, and no one would talk because no one wanted to follow. Over time, that silence became legend. In a world of traffickers who lived like warlords and died like fools, Mayo built a legacy of restraint, of watching, of lasting. His was a power you couldn't photograph, a threat you couldn't quote, a man whose greatest weapon was patience. So when rivals vanished or turned up face down in their own ambition, there were no confessions, no claims, just that cold, invisible nod that everyone understood. The trigger had been pulled. The debt had been paid. And somewhere, far away, a man in a wide-brimmed hat sipped his coffee and looked at the horizon. No words, no blood on his hands, but the legend he wore that like a second skin. To most, the border was a line. To Ismael Zambada, it was a vein, a living artery pulsing with movement, risk, and reward. He didn't just smuggle. He designed. With the mind of a cartographer and the soul of a gambler, he drew routes that didn't just cross land, they crossed people, allegiances, entire systems. Long before satellites watched every inch of desert, Mayo had already memorized the terrain. He knew which rivers changed depth in the rainy season, which mountain paths froze over in winter, which checkpoints were manned by men who liked envelopes, and which by those who liked favors. He didn't need maps, he made them, with his boots, his whispers, and his memory. But it wasn't just geography he mapped. It was loyalty. Every corridor had its guardian, every village its broker, and he knew them all. Who could be trusted? Who needed watching? Who would fold when cornered? And just like the roads, those people became part of the network. Some knew they were working for him. Some didn't. It didn't matter. The routes ran through them all the same. In Baja, he used fishermen. In Sonora, he used cattle trucks. In Chihuahua, old mining tunnels. He turned churches into storage rooms and funeral processions into cover. And all of it ran smoothly, not because he micromanaged, but because he understood systems. Build them right, and they run themselves. Break one piece, and you replace it. No panic, no noise, just motion. Even the American side was mapped. Not just the highways, but the men, the agents with drinking habits, the warehouse foremen with second mortgages, the patrol schedules written in pencil. It wasn't bribery. It was engineering. He didn't buy people. He built around them. Over the years, as the business grew, others tried to build their own maps, but theirs were crude, loud, temporary. Mayo's routes were elegant, quiet, permanent. He didn't flood borders, he seeped through them. He didn't send armies, he sent shadows. And every path he carved added another layer to the myth. Some said he had a gift. Others called it paranoia. But the truth was simpler. He listened. He watched. He adjusted. And most of all, he remembered every road, every name, every betrayal that shifted the wind. By the time the authorities tried to catch up, they weren't chasing a man, they were chasing a maze, a living, breathing network that didn't end at the border. Because Mayo never drew lines, he drew options. And while others got trapped in their own territory, he moved like a ghost through his. Not just the map maker of crime, its master. He was everywhere and nowhere. His voice didn't come through phones. His face never appeared in meetings. But in the deepest corners of the jungle, in dusty towns with no names, and on runways hidden beneath banana groves, his presence was felt. It came in the form of silence before a shipment, a nod from a man no one knew, a change in plans that no one questioned. Mayo Zambada didn't need to show up. He had already arrived. They called it a business of drugs. But what he ran was something else, a business of ghosts. Men who operated without faces, routes that shifted like wind through cane fields, names that changed with the moon. Everything about the organization breathed secrecy, not by accident, but by design. And at the heart of it all was a man who hadn't been seen by law enforcement in decades, yet whose commands shaped entire regions. He didn't make calls, he sent echoes, instructions passed down through layers of trusted lieutenants, encrypted messages, whispers in diners, and static-laced radio calls from mountaintops. No one ever said his name out loud. They didn't have to. Orders didn't need a signature when everyone already knew who they came from. The power wasn't in being unreachable. It was in being unnecessary to reach. By the time a plan reached the hands that would execute it, it had already passed through half a dozen filters, each one chosen for loyalty, silence, and a memory that didn't forget. If the plan failed, the trail dissolved before it could be followed. If it succeeded, no one spoke, not even to celebrate. There were no selfies, no meetings in hotel lobbies, no drunken toasts over finished deals, and yet plane loads of cargo landed, convoys moved without resistance, banks in faraway cities filled with money that couldn't be traced. And when something went wrong, it was corrected with surgical precision often before the mistake reached the man himself. That was the brilliance of it. He didn't run a cartel. He ran an idea, a rhythm, a structure so fluid and invisible that even those inside it didn't always know how far it reached. But when something needed to move, it moved. When someone needed to fall, they did, and all without the man ever raising his voice. In a world obsessed with attention, Mayo mastered absence. In a trade addicted to control, he embraced distance. That's how he stayed free. That's how he stayed alive. And that's why, even now, somewhere in the dust and shadows, his orders are still moving past from ghost to ghost. When the bullets started flying and the headlines screamed his partner's name, Ismael Zambada didn't flinch. While the world chased El Chapo through tunnels and mountaintops, Mayo watched from a safe distance, pen in hand, drawing the next route, the next silence, the next move. He understood something El Chapo never truly learned. Visibility was a weakness. Fame was a trap, disguised as a throne. El Chapo was the lightning. Mayo was the weather. Together, they had built a machine. One loud, one quiet, one on magazine covers, one in the margins. When the world turned its eyes to the escapes, the manhunts, the dramatic captures, Mayo used the distraction like a door left ajar. He didn't panic when his partner fell. He expanded, quietly, ruthlessly. For every corridor the government shut down in its chase for Guzman, Mayo opened 3 more. He moved shipments through new paths, rerouted alliances, replaced compromised men before their names hit the radio. He didn't send flowers to the funerals. He sent instructions, and he never gloated, because he knew how quickly tides turned. But he also knew that while El Chapo's face was plastered across news screens and courtroom sketches, his own remained an outline blurred, unfinished, untouchable. That wasn't just luck. That was strategy. El Chapo was the kind of boss who walked into the room, and made sure everyone saw him. Mayo was the one who'd already been there, made the decisions, and walked out before the door opened. When authorities finally caught Guzman for the last time, Mayo didn't visit, didn't call, didn't beg. He simply adjusted, let the structure flex, not break. He plugged the gaps, moved the chess pieces, and kept going. Because to him, partnership was never about spotlight, it was about structure. He allowed El Chapo to be the face, the shield, the distraction, and in doing so, he preserved the only thing that ever mattered in the long game: freedom. People always asked, who was in charge, Chapo or Mayo? The truth was, it didn't matter, because in the smoke and noise left behind by Chapo's warpath, Mayo built quietly, unbothered, unmoved. While one man fought to escape a cage, the other ensured he'd never see one. So when the world looked at El Chapo and said, "There goes the king," Mayo just kept walking, map in hand, name untouched, and power still in his pocket. There are no photos of him in designer suits, no videos of him at nightclubs, no marble palaces with his name carved into stone. Ismael Zambada does not need a throne to rule. He doesn't need to be seen to be known. His power does not sit, it hovers. It passes through conversations, glances, pauses. It rides on radios in static, cracked commands. It lives in myth, not in marble. He could have chosen the gold, the flash. He had the money, the reach, the legacy. But he chose something harder, something smarter. He chose to vanish, not as an escape, but as strategy. Because the more they looked for him, the more they couldn't find him, the more powerful he became. In the hills of Sinaloa, people talk about him like a story passed down. The man who paid for roads, the man who walked through markets with no bodyguards, the man who could disappear even when standing right in front of you. There are no parades in his name. But there is a kind of reverence, a kind of fear. Not the trembling kind, the quiet kind, the kind that keeps people loyal, even when they don't know why. When other traffickers fell, they left behind palaces and mistresses and fleets of armored trucks. Mayo left behind questions, rumors, trails that led to nothing, because he never ruled from above. He ruled from beside, from within, from just far enough that you couldn't touch him, but close enough that you always felt him. He didn't bark orders. He whispered them through others. He didn't mark territory with guns. He marked it with stability, with systems, and in a world full of kings fighting for the biggest chair, he found power in the space between them. He is not immortal, but he made his name untouchable. They say the true king is the one who never has to prove it. That was Mayo. He didn't claim the crown. He didn't have to. He outlasted it. And in the silence left by the fallen, his legend only grew. So no, there is no throne, no crown, no anthem, but there is a name. And in every whispered deal, every untouched warrant, every unspoken fear, that name still rules, not from presence, but from absence. And in that absence, he became something more than a king. He became a ghost that governs. He doesn't cross borders. He erases them. While most traffickers see the line between nations as a wall to climb or a fence to cut, Ismael Zambada sees it as a suggestion, one that can be rewritten with time, trust, and the right whispers. He doesn't need tunnels. He doesn't need drones. He needs people. And people, unlike fences, can be persuaded. He never steps foot into the United States. Not because he can't, but because he doesn't need to. The border moves for him. The air shifts. The agents blink. And trucks roll through with cargo that never gets counted. His genius isn't in how he smuggles, it's in how he listens. Who's in debt? Who's overworked? Who drinks too much? Who's angry at their superiors? He learns the soft spots not from satellites, but from silence. Mayo built something bigger than a route. He built a rhythm, a dance. Trucks, trains, fishing boats, crop dusters, every one of them part of a system that runs smoother than any government pipeline. Because in his system, Every man is paid on time, every risk is measured, and every whisper is worth more than a bullet. He doesn't corrupt, he recruits, not with threats, but with math. A low-paid border agent makes more in one envelope than in a year of honest work. And Mayo never cheats his partners. That's the rule. You do your part, you get paid. No noise, no drama. Just the quiet promise of a safer life if you keep your mouth shut. Some agents refuse, some hold the line. But even they become part of the map. Not every border needs to open, just enough. And those that won't, he goes around them. There's always another valley, another crossing, another name willing to take the risk for the reward. And if someone talks too much, someone else listens. Mayo understands what governments forget. Borders are just lines, but people are bridges. You don't have to kick down the gate if you own the man holding the key. That's why American officials know his name but not his face. That's why every major bust feels like chasing the tail of a ghost. Because Mayo never leaves prints. He leaves influence. He doesn't enter the country, he enters the system. And once he's in, good luck pushing him out. To this day, he has never been caught crossing that line. But the border still moves for him. Because power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it just whispers. It didn't trickle in. It poured. Under Ismael Zambada's quiet rule, cocaine didn't just cross into the United States, it carved its own highways. While others bragged, while others made headlines and posed with seized bricks and shiny weapons, Mayo stayed off camera. And yet, behind the curtain, it was his flood, his tide, his empire of powder. They say at the height of it, 1 million pounds of cocaine moved on his word, not with chaos, but with choreography. Planes that flew low under radar, trucks that drove routes so routine they vanished into the noise, fishing boats drifting just far enough offshore, mules who never knew what they carried, and every package had its place, every risk, its cost. America didn't see the man behind the curtain, it saw the product, it felt the hunger. In alleys, in dorm rooms, in boardrooms. Cocaine became the great equalizer cutting across class, race, ambition. And with every line snorted, a whisper echoed all the way back to Sinaloa. The money moved in silence. Mayo didn't need to count it. He just needed to make sure it never stopped. He never touched the powder himself. That wasn't his role. He built the lanes. He hired the right pilots, paid off the right dock workers, built invisible bridges of loyalty from Colombia to Chicago. While others flashed their weapons and made enemies, Mayo learned names. He learned where a man's daughter went to school, what a judge owed on his mortgage, which port official had a weakness for fast cars. He didn't win with firepower, he won with understanding. And when a load went missing, or an agent got too close, the machine didn't stall. It rerouted, quietly, always forward. Because Mayo understood that in this world, violence is a tool, but consistency is an empire. He could afford to lose a shipment. He could not afford to lose trust. The press counted seizures. They measured busts in pounds. But what they never understood was this. The cocaine they caught was the tax Mayo paid to keep moving. 1 million pounds did not mean recklessness. It meant design, scale, patience. He didn't celebrate milestones. He marked them with silence. Another city opened. Another rival crumbled. Another warehouse filled with money, untouched by law or time. All while his name stayed off the ledgers, off the headlines, off the lips of those who wanted to live. They called it a war on drugs. But Mayo never went to war. He went to work. And for decades, business was good. The planes didn't roar. They hummed, low and steady, their bellies full of white powder, their paths mapped not by radar but by trust. In the golden years of the trade, while governments fumbled over air patrols and broken intelligence, Mayo Zambada was drawing invisible flight paths across the sky, and behind every descent onto a dirt airstrip or hidden desert runway, there was always a name his. Pilots were never soldiers. They were craftsmen, adventurers, Some had once flown for governments, some for cartels, but all of them, eventually, flew for Mayo. Because he didn't just pay well, he paid wisely, in full, on time, with respect. No chaos, no double crosses, just a handshake and a promise that you'd land safe and leave richer. The airstrips were everywhere, yet nowhere. Some carved into jungle clearings, disguised by banana groves. Others hidden in the dry skin of northern Mexico, just a breath away from the Arizona line. In satellite images, they looked like nothing. In reality, they were arteries, beating, pulsing, feeding the trade like veins feeding a heart. And when a plane vanished from one radar and reappeared in American airspace, it didn't happen by luck. It happened because Mayo had already mapped the wind, already spoken to the eyes watching the skies. The flight wasn't a risk, it was a rehearsal, perfected over years, practiced in silence. The payoffs weren't bags of cash flung across tables. They were calculated, entered into ledgers that would never be found. A mechanic in Sonora, a fuel technician in Guatemala, a tower operator in Yucatan who always looked the other way at the right moment. Everyone had a role, everyone had a price, and everyone who worked with Mayo learned the most important lesson. Loyalty isn't built with fear, it's built with certainty. Even the Americans knew something was off. Planes would land in abandoned fields outside Tucson or glide onto dusty runways in New Mexico, off the books and off the grid. By the time someone noticed, the cargo was gone, dispersed, disguised, deposited, and the pilot, back in Mexico, drinking coffee in a town no one could pronounce. To catch a plane was a victory on paper, but to Mayo, it was a sacrifice already counted, a cost absorbed. Because he never put everything on one wing, he put everything on the system, and the system flew like clockwork. So while the world argued over drug policy and air patrols, Mayo Zambada didn't need to cross borders or carry bricks. He just needed the wind to be quiet, and the runway to be waiting. There are places in Sinaloa where the roads get fixed not by the state but by a man no one sees, where clinics get medicine not from government supply chains, but from whispered deliveries at dawn, where birthdays come with cake, even when the power is out and the banks are closed. These are the Pueblos de Mayo, not marked on official maps, but real. Breathing places held together by one invisible hand. When the government sends troops, the people lower their voices. When Mayo sends gifts, the people sing. Because here, loyalty doesn't come from speeches or flags. It comes from the man who never forgot them. While politicians change every 6 years and promises dry up like riverbeds in the heat, Mayo's help stays steady, predictable, quiet, but never absent. He pays the teachers when the state forgets, buys new uniforms when the old ones tear, makes sure the clinic has antibiotics, the water runs clear, and the church roof doesn't leak. And he does it without press conferences, without banners, without needing a statue. His reward is the silence, the protection that no bullet can buy, the kind that lives in every unspoken word, in every warning whispered before a patrol arrives. There are stories of a wedding where the bride's father couldn't afford the music, and somehow, by nightfall, a band arrived. Of a boy needing a heart surgery in the capital, and by morning, a car and a doctor were waiting outside his house. No receipts, no questions. Just the quiet machinery of a man who rules not through fear, but through care calculated to build something deeper than control. The government calls it infiltration. The people call it help. And in these towns, it's hard to argue with results. When the trucks break down, Mayo sends fuel. When the rains wash out the bridge, Mayo sends workers. When the army comes to ask questions, no one remembers anything. Not because they're afraid, but because they're loyal. The strange thing is, these aren't castles. These aren't fortresses. These are dusty villages with dogs sleeping under mango trees and kids kicking soccer balls made of rags. But the air feels different. Not heavier, but watched. Like the trees themselves know who feeds them. In these towns, the mayor might wear the sash, but everyone knows who truly runs things. And when the birthday comes, and the cake arrives frosted, boxed, always right on time, no one asks who sent it. They already know, and they smile. Because here, in the Pueblos de Mayo, the ghost is generous. They come in fast, boots on gravel, choppers slicing the dawn, radios crackling with urgency. But inside the warehouse, there's nothing. Just dust, oil stains, and the echo of something that used to be there. No crates, no men, no fingerprints. The scent of diesel hangs in the air, like a ghost that left minutes ago. Every time they think they've got him, they're already behind. One step behind. Always. The files say it shouldn't be possible. The agencies have satellites, phone taps, informants. They have floor plans and schedules and budgets. But what they don't have is Mayo's timing. He doesn't run. He drifts, slides out of reach like mist between fingers. By the time the order comes down, the safe house is empty. The van has already crossed 2 states. The phone used to make the call is melting in a barrel somewhere outside Culiacan. He never brags. That's part of the magic. You can't catch what doesn't need to be seen. His routes are written in code, passed face to face, or not at all. His drivers don't know their cargo. His guards don't know the address until the last mile. The fewer who know, the safer the truth. It's not just a policy, it's religion. Sometimes a name leaks, a location, a meeting. But when the door gets kicked open, all that's left is a candle still burning or a beer still cold, just enough to make it sting, to remind them, you were close, but not close enough. He doesn't move in panic. He moves in rhythm. 1 beat ahead of the law, 2 beats ahead of betrayal. They say he even plants false tips, safe houses meant to be found, phones meant to be traced, just to measure how fast the agencies respond. Not to test his luck, but to test theirs. And when someone does talk, when a cousin, a pilot, a middleman decides to trade names for protection, it still doesn't work. Because Mayo doesn't stay where he once was. He stays where no one looks. Not in palaces or penthouses, in orchards, in cattle sheds, in forgotten fishing towns where the air smells like salt and gasoline. The agents grow older. The files get thicker. But the man remains missing. And every time they think they've found the trail, the smoke clears and all that's left is silence. 1 step, that's all he needs. 1 step ahead, and that's all it's ever taken. When the Beltran Leyva brothers turned, it wasn't with words, it was with bullets. Trust shattered like glass on pavement. What had once been a federation of kings became a chessboard soaked in blood. Men who'd once shared meals now shared hit lists. But while others scrambled for territory, Mayo Zambada didn't panic. He pivoted. The split wasn't clean. Never island bodies began showing up on both sides of the border. In Sonora, in Sinaloa, in quiet towns that had once believed themselves spared. The Beltrans had intel. They had soldiers. They had rage. But what they didn't have was the long game. And that's where Mayo thrived. He didn't shout. He didn't make speeches. He listened. Let others scream on the phone and threaten with headlines. He remained quiet, steady, calculating. Because he understood what war really was. It wasn't just about bullets. It was about movement, about timing, about knowing where to stand when the dust settles. His rivals moved like fire. Fast, destructive, but uncontrollable. Mayo moved like water. Around obstacles, beneath them, through them if he had to. The Federation's collapse didn't break him, it trimmed the fat. The unreliable fell away. The loud ones died first. And what remained was leaner, quieter, sharper. He absorbed the blows, then responded not with armies but with whispers. A lieutenant turned here. A stash house flipped there. One by one, the pillars of the Beltran's empire began to tilt. Not through open war but through corrosion, quiet pressure, silent defection, money in the right hands, a threat whispered at the right time. Even law enforcement didn't know what to make of it. 1 week, they're chasing Sinaloa. The next, they're hunting Beltran Leyva cells. Then back again, the lines blurred. Because Mayo never wore a jersey. He didn't scream allegiance. He just moved the pieces and watched others swing. At times, his own allies questioned him. Why not fight louder? Why not send a message? But that was the message. While they buried brothers and burned bridges, he built new ones. He reached out to plazas others ignored, took in lieutenants others discarded, not because he was desperate, but because he knew that in chaos, patience is power. And when the war finally began to cool, when headlines shifted and new names rose, Mayo remained, unburned, uncaught, uncrowned, but never unfeared, because in the end, the Beltrans taught him something he already suspected. Loyalty is fragile, war is expensive, but silence survives. He lives in a world of whispers, not wires. In an age where presidents tweet and criminals live stream their crimes, Mayo leaves no digital shadow, no Instagram selfies, no encrypted voice notes, no vacation videos with palm trees in the background. There is not a single confirmed recording of his voice, not one verifiable image taken in this century. In a world obsessed with documenting everything, he has documented nothing. He is the last analog king in a digital empire, and it is not by accident. Every click is a liability, every lens a threat. Surveillance is no longer a man in a van, it's a pocket, a satellite, a friend's phone left on the table. So Mayo lives like a myth, not unseen but unproven. The stories swirl, but the evidence never sticks. The few who claim to have met him don't agree on his face. Some say he wears a hat low, others say his eyes are what you remember most. But always, the tale ends the same. No photos, no recordings, no trace. A handshake in the dark, a voice behind the curtain, and then gone. He doesn't text, he doesn't email. His messages move through mouths, not machines. Couriers, family, old-school payphones that vanish after one use. To track him is to chase smoke in the desert. By the time you get close, the wind has changed. Authorities have tried everything. Facial recognition, signal triangulation, drone surveillance. But it's like trying to catch a shadow with a flashlight. He's not just avoiding the spotlight, he's dismantled the stage. The digital age thrives on vanity. Cartels once carved names into corridos, posted stacks of cash and gold-plated guns online. Not Mayo. He understands something they forgot. Fame feeds ego, and ego feeds mistakes. He never played for the crowd. He plays for control, and you don't need to be seen to control. Even his enemies respect the discipline, because it takes more than fear to stay hidden. It takes restraint, a kind of stillness that most men can't endure. No headlines, no parades, just the steady rhythm of staying alive, staying free, and staying unknown. He is proof that the most powerful man in the room might be the one no one sees. That in a world begging to be noticed, sometimes the smartest move is to vanish. Not once, but always. And so, the legend grows. But the man, he remains offline. When the news broke that Vicente Zambada had been arrested, the world leaned in. Cameras flashed. Prosecutors smiled. For the first time in years, they had something that felt like leverage, a bloodline. Mayo's bloodline, his son, his heir. And surely, they thought, this would flush the ghost into the open. But it didn't. There was no rage, no retaliation, no ransom, no desperate messages or acts of vengeance. Just silence, cold and measured. The kind of silence that unnerves even the most confident agents. Because silence from a man like Mayo isn't surrender, it's calculation. Vicente had grown up close to the machinery. He wasn't raised with bedtime stories, he was raised with roots, codes, and lessons in survival. He knew where the doors were and how to vanish through them. But he didn't vanish fast enough. caught on foreign soil, handed over to American hands. And just like that, he was a prince behind bars. They expected the old man to break, or at least blink. But the myth held. Instead of panic, there was strategy. Instead of violence, there was vacuum. Mayo shifted people, moved weight, rearranged allegiances like a chessboard no one else could see. While the cameras stared at courtrooms and mugshots, he rewrote the map. Some whispered that Vicente flipped, that he cooperated. Others said it was all part of a longer game, a setup, a sacrifice, a delay. The truth, as always, was hidden behind a wall of sealed documents and half-smiles. But one thing was clear. Mayo never lost control. Succession, in a world like his, isn't just about blood. It's about belief, discipline, reputation. And while Vicente's name echoed in courtrooms, Mayo's name never left the mountain trails and jungle paths. He kept the routes open, kept the product moving, and, most of all, kept the fear alive. Because while one son wore chains, the father wore shadows, and in those shadows, the real power remained untouched, unmoved, and utterly undisturbed. In the heart of Chicago, under the sterile lights of a federal courtroom, the silence that had followed Mayo for decades finally cracked. Vicente Zambada sat in the witness box, not as a son loyal to a legacy, but as a man unraveling it. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his words carved with weight and betrayal, and behind every syllable was a name his father's. El Mayo, he said, not once, not as a whisper, but over and over again, until the name filled the chambers like smoke. Agents leaned forward. Reporters scribbled with frantic hands. For the first time, the myth had a pulse in the public record. This wasn't a ghost story passed between agents over beers. This was testimony. Legal, sworn, dangerous. Vicente gave them details how the routes worked, how the bribes flowed, how the planes disappeared into jungles and re-emerged across borders. He named lieutenants, described safe houses, outlined entire operations like a general remembering old wars. And still, Mayo remained absent. There were no handcuffs, no press conferences, no mugshot to flash on the evening news. While his son spoke behind bulletproof glass, the father remained just that, a whisper. Authorities scrambled. They thought they had a map now. They thought the walls would close in, but every door they opened led to another empty room. Every trail turned cold just as they arrived. It was as if Mayo had been expecting this, as if his son's betrayal had been calculated into the cost of survival. The court asked questions. Vicente answered them. But the man behind the myth remained untouched, and in that courtroom, the silence wasn't just eerie, it was power. Because as Vicente named names and diagrammed a kingdom, one truth became painfully clear. You can put a son on trial, but the ghost? The ghost has already moved on. They found the first body by a roadside ditch in Sonora. No wallet, no phone, no witnesses. Just the unmistakable markings of a lesson learned too late. Then another turned up in a burned-out truck outside Culiacan. Then another, and another. None of them made headlines. No police statements, no press conferences. But in the world that watches shadows, everyone got the message. Mayo had spoken. Not with threats, not with interviews, but with precision. Each target had been close enough to Vicente's betrayal to feel the heat of it. Lawyers, couriers, men who had once carried secrets and now carried guilt. Some had disappeared for weeks before surfacing in morgues or shallow graves. Others never surfaced at all. There was no signature. Just silence where noise once lived. And that's how you knew it was him. Revenge wasn't rushed. It wasn't loud. It was surgical. It was disciplined. It was the kind of retaliation that doesn't need to explain itself. The kind that lets everyone else fill in the blanks with fear. Because in Mayo's world, betrayal doesn't come with a trial. It comes with a countdown. And when the countdown ends, there's no explosion, just absence. Absence of breath, absence of movement, absence of mercy. He didn't need to tell the world he was still in control. The bodies did that for him. They whispered what the courtrooms couldn't. They reminded the Federation, the rivals, the watchers, and the weak. Vicente may have talked, but Mayo still decides who breathes and who doesn't. When Joaquin Guzman fell the first time, it was a spectacle: sirens, headlines, and a sea of armored vehicles. The second fall was even louder, dragged from a safe house tunnel with the world watching. But in both times, in both takedowns, one thing remained constant. Mayo stayed invisible. No raids, no arrests, no sightings, just a name that kept breathing behind locked mouths and silent hills. As El Chapo's empire cracked, the vultures circled, allies scattered, rivals schemed, politicians claimed victory. But in the chaos, a strange calm emerged, and in the center of that calm was the man no one could find. While Guzman faced trial, Mayo expanded roots. While courtrooms filled with lawyers and guards, Mayo filled ledgers and fields. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He adjusted, he adapted, he outlasted. Because where Guzman loved the spotlight, Mayo studied the shadows. The world called Guzman the boss, the kingpin, the face. But faces get recognized, faces get caught. Mayo never wanted that crown. He wanted time. And time is the one currency the loud never get to spend. With El Chapo gone, the Sinaloa Federation needed a pulse, a direction, a spine. Mayo gave them all three from a distance. No videos, no public commands, just orders that moved like wind through canyons felt but never seen. He had watched the rise of rivals, watched them build empires on blood and ego, watched them fall to microphones and betrayals. And now, with Guzman behind bars for life, the myth of Mayo stood taller than ever, not because he was feared, but because he endured. While others chased glory, he chased silence. And now, with every other king in a cage or a grave, Mayo wasn't just the last man standing. He was the only one who never knelt. The war left splinters, too many bodies, too many cameras, too many loud names etched in court transcripts and tombstones. But when the smoke faded and the noise settled, what was left wasn't silence, it was strategy. And at the center of it all was the man who never stood in front of a camera, never boasted, never broke, just waited. Mayo did not rebuild what was lost. He rebuilt what was possible. Gone were the sprawling armies and parades of armed trucks through mountain towns. Gone were the narco corridos praising bloodshed. This time, the Federation was a whisper, not a roar. Smaller crews, tighter cells, fewer mistakes, no names, just tasks. He didn't need to reclaim Sinaloa. He already owned its veins. But now, he moved through them differently. Less like a storm, more like a current. Invisible, vital. The new lieutenants weren't always killers. Some were accountants, coders, pilots with clean records, farmers with debts. Not the kind that show up on most wanted lists, but the kind who get things done. Routes shifted. Old plazas were handed off to allies who knew how to keep peace, not headlines. Violence was no longer policy. It was punctuation, and every now and then, when some young boss tried to make a name through chaos, that punctuation came swiftly and silently. The reborn Federation didn't celebrate birthdays. It didn't hold meetings. It didn't need loyalty oaths. It had only one commandment: do not bring attention. And the people who broke that rule didn't get second chances. They just stopped existing. Mayo turned the cartel into an organism, not a gang, not a cult, something cellular, adaptive, immune to capture because there was no head to cut off. Only motion, only memory, only myth. He didn't come down from the mountains. He became them. And in the valley towns and border cities, the streets quieted. Because even without a face, even without a throne, everyone knew he was still watching. He was still building. He was still in control. The sky hums with surveillance. Unmanned drones circle mountain ridges like vultures with antennas. Satellites blink in the black, peering down on the folds of Sinaloa with lenses sharp enough to read license plates from orbit. But they cannot find him, not even a footprint. They bring in dogs, dozens of them, trained to smell fear, money, gunpowder, blood. The kind of dogs that chase ghosts for a living. But even the dogs get tired. Mayo is not in a hideout. He is not in a jungle compound with golden faucets and armed guards. That is how others fall. That is how Guzman fell, twice. Mayo sleeps where the wind changes names every morning, where paths are not paved but remembered, where no one carries a phone and every story ends with a silence. Sometimes a cave, sometimes a mule trail, sometimes a room behind a chapel that doesn't exist on any map. The DEA's maps are beautiful. They glow in dark rooms where men in suits sip burnt coffee and point to red zones. But every red dot is one step behind. Every lead is a whisper already gone cold. They tap phones that never ring. They follow cars that are decoys. They tail men who are already being watched by Mayo himself. His legend makes them nervous, not because he is violent, but because he is absent. He does not post videos. He does not send threats. He does not dye his hair or wear fake mustaches. He simply isn't there. And yet, drugs move, money moves, towns stay quiet, roads stay open. In 1994, they said he had died. In 2006, they said they had him cornered. In 2018, they called him a ghost. But ghosts don't pay teachers. Ghosts don't send cake to funerals. Ghosts don't build empires of flesh and silence. The jungle never betrays him. The people don't either. Because sometimes loyalty isn't bought, it's inherited. And sometimes the man who vanishes is more real than the ones on camera. So the satellites keep spinning, the agents keep listening, the dogs keep sniffing, and Mayo keeps walking unseen. Not because he is lucky, but because he never stopped learning how to disappear. The man is not off the grid. He is the reason there is no grid. He walks behind the wind, his name spoken in whispers, his face remembered only in fragments. To some, he is already gone dead in the mountains, swallowed by time like a vanished saint or a cursed king. To others, he was never real to begin with. Just a story told to scare rivals and remind allies that power doesn't always need a spotlight. But those who know really know they never laugh when they hear the name. El Mayo, El Fantasma, the ghost. Not because they believe in ghosts, but because they know he believes in not being seen. In the border towns, soldiers patrol in convoys, helicopters cut across the sky, and roadblocks bloom like weeds. But in the valleys, in the orchards and shadows of the Sierra Madre, there are places no one goes without permission, places where the wind shifts when a stranger arrives, where the men still tip their hats to an invisible patron, and where even the dogs seem to know who feeds the town. There are no photos, not real ones, just blurred frames, grainy shots that might be him or might not. A man in a cowboy hat walking with a limp, a shadow slipping through a crowd, a glimpse of someone at a funeral, too old to be a threat, too calm to be afraid. By the time the authorities arrive, that someone is gone, and the silence is back in charge. In a world of narcos who chase fame like moths to flame videos, gold-plated rifles, music videos, Mayo is made of smoke. He doesn't sing, he doesn't boast, he doesn't run, he vanishes, and still, things move. Shipments land, wires are tripped, meetings are held under trees older than the Republic. Mayo doesn't attend, but his decisions are felt like a change in temperature. He doesn't threaten, but men disappear. He doesn't ask, but favors are done before the request is spoken. Some young sicarios think he's too old now, that he's lost his edge, that maybe the legend is just dust. But the older ones, they know better. They've seen too many smart mouths go quiet after a single wrong word. They've seen commanders shift allegiances without being told. They've watched rivals rise, shout, then bleed out in silence. El Fantasma isn't a myth. He's the reason myths exist. Not because he is unstoppable, but because he is unreadable. A man who traded the world's spotlight for its shadows. A man who learned early that power doesn't need applause, just memory and fear. And somewhere, right now, he's listening. Or maybe not. Maybe he's tending to his horses. Maybe he's watching the clouds roll over a quiet valley. Or maybe he's already behind you. They call it loyalty, but it's not born from friendship. It's not the kind of thing you toast over beers or swear under sunlight. With Mayo, loyalty is grown like poppies cultivated in silence, watered in paranoia, harvested in blood. His men don't follow him because they love him. They follow him because they don't know what happens if they stop. Some have tried. A cousin here, a driver there. Men who thought they could take what they learned and sell it to the other side. They vanish. Sometimes their families do too. Not in a burst of violence, not in the chaos of war, but quietly, as if they had never existed, as if the desert swallowed their names. And those who stay, they learn what matters. You don't speak Mayo's name in anger. You don't guess his moves. You don't ask where he island. You only ask what he needs. His inner circle is a riddle. No social media, no flashy watches, no corridos written in their honor. They blend into the crowd. Ranchers, mechanics, teachers. Some of them even vote. And yet, they can shut down a highway with one call, reroute a shipment with a nod, order a killing with a whisper. They are not kept by promises. They are kept by Mayo's gift, his ability to make himself feel like the center of gravity. He gives his men land, livestock, silence. He builds lives that feel like empires until the moment he decides they're not, and so they stay. They raise children who never ask questions. They marry women who understand absence. They buy homes with money that's never discussed, because to serve Mayo is to inherit a kind of sacred dread. He never yells. He never forgets. His silence is the warning. His patience is the punishment. And in that quiet, his men find a strange kind of faith, not in him as a man, but in him as a myth. Years pass. Governments change. Other bosses fall. But Mayo's core remains untouched, like an untouched altar deep in the forest. Because every man in that circle knows the same truth. He is not just the one who pays them. He is the one who sees them, knows their weaknesses, their doubts, their sins. He is the reason their families live in homes instead of graves. And maybe that's the most terrifying kind of loyalty, the kind you never chose. The kind that chose you. The kind that wraps around your name like a prayer or a noose. They say he walks slower now, that his knees ache when the mist clings to the Sierra like a second skin, that his voice, once sharp as broken glass, is now a quiet rasp, like wind brushing over dry corn stalks. But no one who says this has ever seen him, not truly. They've seen silhouettes, hints, echoes, the way a horse rides out of a village before the soldiers arrive, the way a phone call ends a war before it begins, but not the man himself, not in years. He is called many things. Some whisper El Viejo, others say El Ultimo, the last one, the last of the generation that made empires with machetes and smuggled ghosts across borders before satellites could blink. He is not on Instagram. His face doesn't show up in leaked documents or grainy surveillance photos. He doesn't need to be visible to be known. He only needs to be remembered. There is no presidential term for him to outlast, no campaign to wait through. His kingdom doesn't end at the ballot box. It begins where roads stop being paved. It begins in the rusted silence of small villages, in ranches that exist on no map, in families that answer to one name only. His, not the one on the birth certificate, the other one, the name that floats like pollen through the mountains, El Mayo. Soldiers pass through these places, helicopters come and go, drones hum overhead, and still, he moves like a shadow just ahead of the lens, a day too early, a ridge too far. Some say he sleeps underground, Others say he never stops moving, that even in old age, he rides with a younger man's urgency, that his bed is wherever his hat hangs that night. But again, no one knows. They only guess. His age is now a weapon. Every year he is said to be weaker, more frail, more forgotten. He becomes more dangerous, because men who are underestimated are men who are free to maneuver. Let the world think he is dying, that he is a whisper of a legend, that his time has passed. He'll use that illusion like camouflage, and so they wait. Rivals, informants, soldiers. They wait for proof that he's finally vulnerable, that the throne has truly been vacated. But proof never comes. Only rumors. Only stories. A cartel boss once bragged that Mayo would never last another season. That was 3 seasons ago. He died with his mouth still open. The truth is, Mayo doesn't have to be seen anymore. His name moves on its own now. Like weather, like a warning. He built a kingdom that doesn't need its king to sit in a palace. He is the mountain. He is the wind between the mango trees. He is the silence after the gunfire. And until the day someone proves otherwise, he is still king, not because he stands in front of men, but because men still kneel. He moves like fog through the valleys, never too fast, never too slow, always just out of reach. There are no photographs, no verified sightings, no footprints that last more than a few hours. Only whispers, a silhouette caught in the rearview mirror, a rustle in the cornfield long after midnight, a truck that passes with windows too dark to read, and always the feeling that someone was just here, just moments ago. They say his convoys use no headlights, that they drive without radios, that no 2 routes are ever repeated. He trusts maps drawn by memory and men who have no phones. Sometimes, a caravan of mules will carry the trail forward. Other times, he flies low beneath radar, over canyons so narrow that the planes brush treetops. There are no selfies. There are no text messages. If he wants to speak to someone, he sends a man on foot. His safe houses are not mansions. They are not the garish gold-plated hideouts of the brash or the reckless. They are adobe homes tucked behind orange groves, chicken farms with buried basements. Sometimes they are churches, sometimes caves. Each one is known by only one person, and once it has served its purpose, it is burned, sold, or left to the wild dogs. The old man leaves no trail, only silence. In towns along the Sierra, people say he walks with a limp now, that he wears a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, that his voice is slow, almost tender, but that when he gives an order, it cuts through steel. A woman in a small village swears she saw him once, passing through during a storm. He gave her son a wrapped piece of bread, patted his head, and vanished by dawn. She never told her neighbors until years later, when rumors reached them about who had slept in her barn that night. She still keeps the boy's hat, never washed, never folded. He does not travel with an army. 1 or 2 men, no more. Never the same ones twice. If someone is caught, they know nothing. If someone talks, they disappear. He never stays longer than 1 night. He never lights a fire. He carries no phone, no wallet, no paper. His name is never spoken, not even among his own. When he leaves, even the animals act like they never saw him. There are children born in the mountains who believe he is a ghost. Not a man, but a spirit of vengeance or protection depending on who you ask. In some places they pray to him. In others, they curse his name. But no one doubts he exists. He is a rumor that walks. And the truth is, maybe even he no longer knows exactly who he island. A farmer who became a general who became a shadow, a man who built a kingdom in silence, and now lives on the edge of it, always moving, always watching, never staying long enough to cast a second shadow. He does not look back, because there's nothing behind him but bodies, and the only thing ahead is the next night. They hear it before they understand it. His name, whispered by fathers tightening the locks at night. His legend, etched into conversations between mothers who speak softly while folding laundry under the hot breath of the Sunday. In the hills of Sinaloa, his name lives in the wind carried through sugarcane stalks, corn rows, and fields laced with secrets. He is not taught in schools, but every child knows him. By the time they are old enough to ride bikes along the dirt roads, they have already heard the stories of how he helps families who fall on hard times, of how he built roads where the government sent none, of how sometimes, during lean seasons, trucks arrive with rice, beans, and medicine, no explanation, no receipts, just supplies and silence. His generosity is remembered, but always paired with a warning: be loyal, be quiet, and never ask questions you don't want answers to. In every village, there's a version, a different tale told around flickering porch lights and wood stoves. Some say he once escaped an entire battalion by hiding in a hollowed-out tree. Others say he crossed into the United States on foot, walked straight past Border Patrol, and disappeared into the desert like smoke. Children grow up repeating these like fairy tales, passing them down like oral scripture. A man of magic, a man of monsters, a man of both. On schoolyard walls, his face appears in crude drawings, never accurate, never the same, twice. A mustache here, a hat there. But always, the eyes are left blank, because no one really knows what his eyes look like. Even the DEA, with all their money and machines, only has guesses. They track the movements of his people. They intercept his shipments, but they have never captured his gaze. He is a legend with no face. Some of the boys who hear his name in bedtime stories grow up to chase it. They join the lower ranks, running errands, guarding fields, cleaning guns, hoping, maybe, that someday they'll get close enough to hear his voice. Fewer girls chase that dream, but they too know the rules, the power, the threat. Everyone in Sinaloa speaks his name carefully, as if it has sharp edges. But in the silence between stories, another truth creeps in. One the elders speak less often, that even legends grow old, that power does not always protect, that one day, the man behind the stories may fall, and the stories may change. Heroes become tyrants, protectors become phantoms, and myths, eventually, forget their own beginnings. Still, every generation adds a new chapter, a new rumor, a new miracle or massacre. The name survives because it is needed both as a symbol of fear and a shield against it. In places abandoned by the state, forgotten by maps, he is the one who stayed. Children hear his name. They repeat it. They carry it like a charm, not knowing if they are invoking a man, a myth, or a warning wrapped in kindness. But knowing this, in the leaves of Sinaloa, his story is still growing. They campaign in public, but they win in private. In dusty towns and polished boardrooms, everyone knows whose permission matters most. Not the voters, not the party bosses, not even the generals. The quiet nod of one man in the mountains, unseen, unquoted, but unmistakable, decides who rises and who falls. And in Sinaloa, that man is not the president. For decades now, local politicians have made pilgrimages. Some call them meetings, some call them disappearances. They go in nervous and come out calm. Their platforms change after that. So do their enemies. The man they meet never threatens. He just reminds them where the roads came from, who funded the clinics, who protected their families when the ballots did not. In some states, a mayoral race is a contest of ideas. In others, it's a quiet agreement. You run, you win, you listen. And if you forget to listen, your term is cut short not by voters, but by gravity. Because some reminders come from rooftops, or ditches, or notes left under windshield wipers. Still, not all his influence drips with menace. There is structure to it, a code. Candidates who obey find peace, order, even progress. Crime drops not because it vanishes, but because it's organized, predictable, controlled. The chaos of rival gangs is replaced with hierarchy, with rules, with an invisible stability. And the people, tired of blood, quietly approve. Sometimes, order is more valuable than justice. At the federal level, the debts are deeper. Some senators never say his name, but their votes show it. Bills stall, budgets shift, oversight weakens. These are not accidents. These are the signatures of fear and favor. In the Capitol, they joke that no one wants to find him because no one wants to explain how long they've known where he island. A few brave souls push back. They call for reform. They scream about corruption. They end up transferred, retired, or reassigned to places where microphones don't reach. The rare whistleblower either learns silence or becomes the next cautionary tale. In this world, speaking truth is not noble. It is reckless, and reckless men don't last long. He doesn't bribe everyone. That's the myth. The truth is subtler. He doesn't pay for loyalty, he cultivates it. Years of favors, years of restraint. He remembers birthdays. He protects nephews. He sends condolences before the state does. Loyalty like that isn't bought. It's grown, and once grown, it is almost impossible to uproot. His name is not on any official donor list. He doesn't appear in campaign photos, but the power is real. His presence is felt in the way police show up late, in the way judges forget dates, in the way press conferences are canceled at the last moment with a vague apology and a quiet look of fear in the eyes. And still, some wonder how he keeps it all together. How a man wanted by two nations can hold sway over ballot boxes and Senate seats. The answer is simple. He doesn't chase power. He allows it, and in return, it protects him, because everyone who profits from his silence becomes its guardian. So elections come and go. Headlines blare. Promises are made. But beneath the noise, in the unseen architecture of influence, his kingdom stands untouched. Not with banners or campaigns, but with nods, with secrets, with the quiet understanding that in some corners of the country, democracy wears a borrowed face, and he decides whose face it will be. There are names that shake the room when spoken. His is not one of them. Not because it lacks weight, but because it is carried too carefully. In offices lined with bulletproof glass, his name is whispered over encrypted calls, redacted in reports, hidden behind code words and initials. In public, they call him a figure of interest. In private, they call him what he is, the one no one wants to touch. The papers chase blood, shootouts, arrests, flamboyant kingpins dragged in chains. That's what sells. That's what fills columns. But him? He doesn't leave blood in the streets. He leaves silences, gaps in the timeline, cases that go cold, stories that lose momentum before they're told. A reporter once tried to trace him, traveled for months, from courtrooms to mountain towns. What she found were dead ends and nervous glances. No one said his name, not out loud. Her editor pulled the piece, said it lacked proof, said it was too thin. But the reporter never forgot the silence, how heavy it felt, like a curtain made of iron. There are documents, of course, sealed indictments, testimonies from former allies, satellite surveillance that shows convoys moving where no convoys should be. But every time the picture sharpens, something blurs it again. A source recants. A prosecutor is reassigned. A plane crashes. A database is mysteriously wiped. And when arrests come, they circle him like moths around a flame. They get his lieutenants, his accountants, his pilots, and his mules. But the core remains untouched. It's as if he exists just beyond reach, not invisible, but deliberately out of frame. Some say it's fear, that journalists don't print his name because they know what happens when they do, that newspapers in Sinaloa have learned the hard way which stories cost lives. Others say it's politics, that some truths are too inconvenient for headlines, that printing his story means admitting how deep the rot goes. Even international outlets tread carefully. They'll mention cartels, alliances, senior figures, but not him, Not clearly, not repeatedly, because every editor has a boss, and some of those bosses have old favors to repay, or quiet threats to remember. In the end, the silence is not an accident. It is architecture, built deliberately, maintained constantly. There's power in being unnamed, in being the shadow behind the spotlight. He lets others take the stage. Let them burn. Let them fall. Meanwhile, he writes the script. He is the contradiction the press can't print. A man hunted for decades, yet never cornered. A ghost with fingerprints on empires. His story is there, between the lines, if you know how to read it, in the pauses, in the omissions, in the headlines that name everyone but him. They say journalism is about uncovering the truth. But in his world, truth is not uncovered, it is allowed. And until he allows it, the papers will keep printing noise. Never the signal, never the real name behind the war. In the hills where gunfire once echoed like clockwork, the quiet now feels strange. Not holy, not healing, just quiet. And that silence? It isn't the absence of war. It's the shape of a decision. Every so often, when the killing begins to feel too visible, too loud, too messy, he steps back and folds the blade. Not out of regret, not from guilt, but from math. Bodies draw attention. Headlines stir politicians. Dismembered messages scrawled on cardboard bring cameras. And he hates cameras more than rivals. So, he does what few in his world ever learned to do. He pauses. A shipment is rerouted. A commander is told to wait. A grudge that once burned hot is cooled with money, or territory, or just a phone call from a voice they haven't heard in years but never forgot. Suddenly, enemies become neighbors again. Checkpoints relax, markets reopen, mothers let their children walk to school. And the government? They call it progress. Officials take credit. They say the crackdown worked. The operation succeeded. But in truth, nothing changed. The violence didn't end. It was leased. Bought in advance by the one who controls the rhythm of fire and silence alike. He knows that too much peace is dangerous. It invites carelessness. It tempts betrayal. But just enough calm, just enough illusion of control, that buys time. That lets the roads run smoother. The routes move faster. No military blockades. No helicopters buzzing like angry bees. Just wind and dust and profit. In these moments, the people don't know who to thank or fear. They just know the air feels safer, that the nights are quieter, that birthdays aren't interrupted by gunshots. And maybe they pretend it's the mayor, or the governor, or the soldiers patrolling on rusted trucks. But deep down, in the corners of every conversation, they know who it island. They know who allowed the quiet. Of course, the peace never lasts. That's not what it's meant for. It's not a promise. It's a smokescreen, a reset button. Once the shipments are restocked, once the enemy grows bold again, once the timing is right, it breaks. A body in a trunk, a convoy burned, a message sent, louder than words. And the game resumes. Reporters call it a ceasefire. Analysts call it cartel diplomacy. But those are stories for people far from the dust. Here, in the valleys and barrios, they just call it what it is, the unwanted peace. A warning wrapped in calm, a silence paid for in advance. And somewhere, watching from a windowless room, or listening through a phone that cannot be traced, he counts the days. Not the days since the violence stopped, but the days until it starts again. Because for him, peace is not a goal. It's a tool, a disguise. And when it ends, as it always does, no one will be surprised, because the quiet was never a gift. It was a trap, and they all knew it. You are now going to write this chapter, to make it max 700 words long. Do not include bullet points or chapter heads. Make sure to write in the same tone and writing style as example. And also, when writing the story, always spell out every number in full words, including years, for example. 1945 instead of 1945, 1980s instead of 1980s, and 2001 instead of 2001. Do not use digits anywhere in the story. Write everything exactly as it would be spoken, so that a text-to-speech system can pronounce it correctly and naturally. 37. The kingpin who never posed. No interviews. No social photos. No flamboyant lifestyle. Just fields, roads, and whispers. There's a rumor that never dies, even though the man behind it may already have. It floats in barbershops, courtrooms, war rooms, and whispers at kitchen tables he surrendered. Not with handcuffs. Not in shame. Quietly, strategically, like a king stepping down without ever stepping forward. Some say it happened in the early 2000s, maybe earlier. That one of the letters, DEA, CIA, may be something deeper, cut a deal behind closed doors. No cameras, no court. Just a handshake that disappeared into the folds of silence, in exchange for peace or intelligence, or because they knew they'd never catch him any other way. The evidence? There isn't any. That's the point. A few raids that came up empty, a few names that vanished after turning too many stones, and an old man who should have been found by now yet never island. Maybe because no one's really looking anymore. Others believe something simpler, that the war caught up with everyone else but not him. That time, not treachery, is what spared him. He buried his rivals, outlived the rats, learned when to strike and when to vanish. And now? Now the world's changed, but he's still breathing in some safe house no one will ever find. Not because he made a deal, but because he became a ghost before they could even build a cage. The new generation barely mentions him. Their war is louder, flashier. Social media threats and armored convoys, cartels with logos and uniforms. But the old names, the silent ones, they still move weight, still collect debts, still pull strings, especially him, because every so often, a decision gets made that no one understands. A corridor is cleared, a rival is erased, a shipment crosses without a scratch, and buried inside the paper trail, if anyone's patient enough to read between the lines, is the shape of a man who supposedly doesn't exist anymore. Maybe he did surrender. Maybe the terms were never written, only spoken. Maybe he gave them everything they needed, just not himself. And maybe they were satisfied with that. Or maybe it's the oldest con of all. He let the world believe he surrendered so he could stop running, so he could live in peace, while everyone else stayed busy chasing a ghost. Because the truth is, surrender doesn't always look like a man on his knees. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting in the sun, in a village with no name, while the world forgets to look for him. And in that forgetting, he wins. Again, the camera caught her face in profile, lit gently by the soft haze of afternoon. Her voice was steady, not rehearsed, not bitter, just tired, just honest. She said it simply, like she had said it before, but never with the world listening. He was always a good father, just not to the country. There was no trace of apology in her tone, no defense either, not even a need to explain. It was like she had carried the weight of that sentence her whole life, waiting for someone to ask. And now that it had been spoken, she could finally put it down. She didn't flinch when the reporters asked about the bodies, the wars, the empire built on blood. She didn't deny it. She didn't admit it. Instead, she spoke of breakfasts before school, of long walks on dirt roads, of a man who knew how to disappear when the sun set and reappear when the family needed him. He never talked business at home, she said, eyes drifting toward the floor, as if some ghosts still lived there. But we always knew. When she was little, she didn't know what fugitive meant. She only knew her father didn't go to town like other fathers. He didn't pose for photos, didn't take phone calls when the television was on. But when it rained, he brought her inside before the lightning came. When she cried, he sat with her until she stopped. And when the world outside whispered his name like a curse, he spoke to her like a promise. Later, as she grew, she understood what those whispers meant. The name that drifted across newspapers, case files, and courtrooms was the same one that tucked her into bed. The name feared by governments was the same one that braided her hair before church, and she hated it, and she loved him. Both truths could sit side by side. That was the hardest part. He never asked for forgiveness, she said. But he gave everything he had to us. Basting. We Rube spied from Metalfers. There were moments, she said, when he looked tired. Not from running, but from remembering. His hands would go still when she asked about old friends who were no longer around. His voice would drop when she brought up her brother, Vicente. Not because of shame, but because of silence. Silence had always been his language. She doesn't speak often. The interview was brief. Just a few questions, a few answers. But in those answers lived the blueprint of a man who ruled from the shadows and raised a daughter in them too. When it ended, the reporter asked her one last thing. Would she change anything? She paused. Not long. Just enough. I would have asked him to be small, she said. Not powerful. Just ours. Just for us. And with that, she walked off screen. The frame lingered on the chair she left behind, empty, quiet, but still echoing. Just like him. The strange thing about power is that it does not vanish when the man who held it fades. It lingers, it reshapes, it becomes something harder to kill. And so, even if the old man is gone, his federation still breathes. Not in speeches, not in parades of men with rifles, but in the quieter things. A road paved where no government trucks ever reached. A school kept open by envelopes passed under doors. A bribe slipped like a handshake, keeping a checkpoint from turning into a grave. The routes still run like veins across the land, pulsing with product, guarded not by flags but by silence. The soldiers at the border know where to look and where not to look. The agents in the cities know which files will gather dust and which will move forward. That is the genius of his design. It was never about the man. It was about the machinery. He built something that did not need his face. Whispers say that some of his rules still hold. Do not draw attention. Do not fight wars you cannot win. Pay first. Threaten second. Kill only if you must. It sounds like scripture, passed from one generation of traffickers to the next. The young ones who crave the spotlight, who crave songs written about them, they rise quickly and burn faster. But those who follow his commandments, they last. They prosper. They inherit pieces of an invisible kingdom. The strange part is that his federation, for all its blood, carried a kind of order. Not mercy, not kindness, but order. Towns that might have been forgotten by their own governments found themselves bound to him, not by loyalty but by necessity. Clinics stayed stocked. Farmers found markets. Roads were safer under his shadow than under the flag of the state. A cartel with a conscience, some dared to call it. But conscience is not the word. It was calculation. Keeping people fed meant keeping them quiet. And quiet is worth more than gold. Even now, officials speak of dismantling networks, of ending corruption, of cutting down roots that stretch too deep. Yet every time they strike, another branch bends and grows. Because this is not just crime, it is infrastructure. It has been sown into the soil for decades, into the very rhythm of life in valleys and mountains where the government's reach has always been shallow. To uproot it would mean uprooting the people themselves. Some say he is still alive, watching all of this with the patience of a gardener who knows his crops will grow whether he tends them or not. Others say he is long gone, a ghost buried under false names and forgotten graves. But in truth, it does not matter. His presence was always secondary to his design. What remains is a federation without a face, a ghost with roots, a system that bends but does not break, that hides behind ordinary things, a warehouse, a truck, a handshake, a silence. And maybe that was his greatest trick, to make himself unnecessary, to leave behind not a legacy of songs and statues, but a machine that runs even without him. Because kings fall, ghosts linger. And his ghost is not one of memory, it is one of structure. It moves the weight. It pays the bills. It rewrites the rules. And until someone invents a way to kill what cannot be seen, the Federation will remain as faceless as the man who built it. In the cities, time is measured by traffic lights, by bank hours, by the blinking of phones on nightstands. In the mountains, time has no such chains. It bends, it stretches, it hides. And for El Mayo, time has always been less about minutes and more about moments. Each move is measured not against the tick of a second hand, but against the weight of risk. He learned early that survival isn't about rushing. The impatient die quickly, the loud die loudly. But the careful, the ones who wait for the right opening, who know when to step back into the brush and let others burn, those are the ones who outlast empires. The men who worked with him said he kept no calendar on the wall, no wristwatch on his arm. His schedule was written in silence, in pauses, in long stretches of nothing that looked like waiting but were really calculation. A deal that seemed ready on Monday might not close until weeks later, because he knew the soldiers on that road were hungry. A shipment that could have landed on a Friday would be delayed until the moonlight was kinder, until the night belonged to him again. It was not superstition, it was rhythm. The jungle has its own clock, one written in the cries of birds at dusk, the soft crackle of insects before a storm, the rustle of trees when men move where they should not be. El Mayo read those signs better than he read newspapers. Where others trusted satellites and cell towers, he trusted patience. And patience, in his world, was worth more than gold. They say sometimes he would vanish for weeks, letting lieutenants wonder if he was even alive. Then, at the quietest moment, a radio would crackle with his voice, calm, short, final. Orders given like the toll of a bell, no wasted words. And just like that, a convoy would move, a border would open, a rival would disappear. To outsiders, it looked like coincidence, luck. To those inside, it was something sharper. They called it his jungle clock, the way he kept time not by watches but by danger. He knew how long a bribe lasted before it soured, how long a rival's hunger could be starved before he snapped, how long the government could look away before they had to strike. And he moved within those margins, never early, never late. That is why raids arrived to find only empty houses and cold mattresses. That is why his name kept showing up in courtrooms but never on handcuffs. He wasn't faster than them, he was quieter. He let them tire themselves chasing shadows while he kept one eye on the horizon, waiting for the minute the jungle told him it was safe to step forward again. Living like that ages a man differently. The lines on his face were not drawn by years but by vigilance. Each silence cost him something. Each decision carved another scar. But it also kept him alive, long after others, louder, richer, and more famous, were buried. El Mayo did not live by the clock that hangs on walls. He lived by the one only he could hear. A clock of risk, of silence, of rhythm. And as long as that clock kept ticking, he remained the man who could not be caught. A ghost, in perfect time. He has seen them all tumble, one by one. Kings who once strutted across television screens in golden watches and pressed shirts, reduced to mugshots, shackled hands, and headlines that lasted longer than their freedom. El Chapo dragged through tunnels and cages, the Beltrons cut down in blood and bullets. Capos, who once promised eternity, now remembered only in corridos sung with more nostalgia than truth. But him? His story runs differently. There has never been a mugshot, never a courtroom sketch, never a night behind a concrete cell. His name has haunted files in Washington, echoed in sealed indictments in Chicago, been scratched into the margins of cables and intelligence reports, but the door has never opened to a squad shouting his name. The question burns in those who chase him. Why? How? Some say it is luck, but luck does not stretch across half a century. Some say it is corruption, that envelopes and favors reach further than bullets ever could. Others say it is his way of moving, never loud, never reckless, never hungry for the applause that doomed the rest. He never wanted songs. He never wanted fame. He wanted control. And he found it not in the roar of violence, but in the discipline of absence. Where others showed their teeth, he showed nothing. Where others stood in front of cameras, he stayed behind shadows. That restraint built him an empire more enduring than all the blood-soaked crowns that crumbled around him. The agencies have tried. Satellites, drones, informants, soldiers. They drew maps with his name circled in red. They pointed to valleys and mountains, to whispers of safe houses, to stories of meetings by candlelight. Yet every raid ended in emptiness. Every lead dissolved into dust. His presence was always one step behind, one silence ahead. And so, as the years passed, he became something more than a fugitive. He became a question, the only king who never fell, the only man whose myth outlasted the evidence, the ghost who watched his rivals rot while his own trail grew colder than stone. There are children in Sinaloa now who know his name the way they know a saint's, not because they have seen him, but because they have seen what he left behind: roads, schools, a kind of order carved in fear. In their stories, he is less a man than a figure who moves when the world isn't watching. And perhaps that is the truth, because whether he is alive or gone, his crown has never been taken. He is the last sovereign of an empire built on silence. The king without a throne, without a portrait, without a capture date, the one they could never cage. And maybe, when history looks back, that will be his greatest weapon. Not the rivers of cocaine, not the mountains of money, not even the blood that bought him power, but the simple fact that when all the others were dragged into light, he remained in shadow. The only king never caught. They say the old man writes. Not speeches, not orders, not ledgers of shipments and bribes. Something smaller, quieter, a notebook, carried from safe house to safe house, tucked into satchels and glove compartments, guarded more carefully than the guns that protect him. The theory grew from whispers, like most things about him. A cousin once claimed to see it, pages worn thin from the weight of a hand that pressed too hard. A soldier who defected swore it contained no names, no numbers, only sentences broken like confessions. And the story stuck, because people want to believe that even a man made of shadows leaves something written behind. Unlike Escobar, whose notebooks were cluttered with phone numbers and war strategies, they say El Mayos are different. No maps of tunnels, no tallies of debts, just thoughts, scattered in short lines, the way a man speaks to himself when no one else is listening. Regrets, perhaps, half-memories, a father's worry, a farmer's longing for soil under his fingernails instead of blood on his hands. Imagine it, the most wanted man of his generation, sitting in the dim light of a bare room, scribbling with the same patience he once used to carve routes across continents. The silence thick, the walls leaning in, and his words spilling across paper like a man digging a grave for things he cannot say aloud. What would such a notebook hold? Perhaps apologies he will never give, the weight of sons lost to prison, the faces of friends buried in unmarked soil, perhaps a note about the mango groves where he once ran as a boy, the taste of fruit before he knew the price of survival, maybe even prayers, written not to saints or gods, but to time itself to give him one more year, one more season, one more breath outside a cell. The notebook theory endures because it humanizes him in a way his empire never could. A drug lord is a monster, a ghost with a pen is a man, and people crave that contrast. They want to believe that behind the orders, behind the silence, behind the power that shaped decades of violence, there is still a fragile human who wonders if it was worth it. Of course, no one has ever seen it with certainty. Maybe it is myth. Maybe it is smoke invented by those who chase him, needing to imagine him as more than just calculation and survival. Or maybe it exists, hidden in a drawer, its ink slowly fading even as the world still whispers his name. And if it does, Perhaps one day it will surface, found after his death, or confiscated in a raid, or passed secretly through family hands. A final relic, not of deals and guns, but of the thoughts he carried when the world wasn't watching. Until then, the notebook remains a story, a rumor, a possibility that the man who built empires in silence might also have written his regrets in silence too. And maybe that is the cruelest truth, that even if the pages are ever read, they will not erase the blood. They will only show that he knew it was there all along. There is a question that lingers in every whispered conversation about him, heavier than any rumor of betrayal or deal. What if he does not fall like the others? What if there is no final raid, no rooftop gunfight, no grainy photo of his body face down in blood? What if his ending comes not with sirens, but with silence? Imagine it. Somewhere in the Sierra, in a house that no one has marked on a map, he lies down one night and does not rise again. No guards rushing to defend him, no agents battering down the door. Just the stillness of an old man meeting the one enemy he could never outwit, time. If that is how it happens, the world may not even know right away. Days, weeks, months could pass before the first rumor surfaces. A cousin whispers it in town. A priest hears it in confession. A soldier tells it over beer. But without proof, it remains a story. And in his absence, the myth only grows. The government would not celebrate. How could they? There would be no trophy to display, no mugshot, no staged press conference. Without a body, without fingerprints, they cannot declare victory. And so, the silence becomes awkward, unsettling. Did he die, or did he vanish again? Is the ghost finally gone, or is he simply watching from deeper shadows? For his enemies, silence is no closure. Rivals might hesitate to move into his territory, afraid that he still breathes somewhere beyond the ridgeline. They will second-guess every deal, every shipment, wondering if the invisible hand still guides the roads. Power clings to uncertainty, and he has always been a master of uncertainty. For his family, silence is a prison of its own. To bury a man without a grave is to never finish mourning. His children, his grandchildren, they may live with the question forever: did he die as a fugitive or as a father? Did he leave them his shadow, or did he finally let it fall away? And for the people, the villagers who grew up with his name like a hidden prayer, the quiet would be both relief and loss. They may feel safer, yes, but they may also feel abandoned, because even the devil can provide when the state does not. And in that vacuum, his ghost would not disappear. It would harden into legend. If he dies in silence, his ending would not be an ending at all. It would be an echo, a question that keeps haunting borderlands and war rooms alike. Because a man who is never captured, never seen, never proven dead, never truly leaves. He lingers, in the stories, in the roads, in the rules that outlived him. And maybe that is exactly how he planned it. To deny the world its spectacle, to slip away without applause or condemnation, to remain the only king whose fall no one could ever photograph. If he dies in silence, then silence itself becomes his monument. They say he feared nothing, and in a way that was true. He did not flinch at the sight of soldiers. He did not crumble when rivals turned into enemies. He did not lose sleep over the raids that came too late, the indictments stacked in foreign courts, or the billions seized that barely dented his flow. But there was one thing that kept him awake, one shadow that stretched longer than all the others: the fear of a name. Not his own, but the wrong one spoken by the wrong mouth. It was not bullets that ended empires, he knew. It was words. A whispered betrayal in the back room of a bar, a careless conversation at a family gathering, a lover speaking to someone who was not supposed to know. Every capture, every fall of every king he had ever watched, began with a mouth, not a raid, not a drone, a mouth. So he built his life around silence, not absence, but discipline. Even his closest lieutenants never heard everything. They were given fragments, never the whole. Each man knew just enough to survive, but never enough to break him if they fell. It was a system not of trust but of limitation, and it kept him safe where others burned. He slept lightly, if at all. His body may have rested, but his mind stayed moving. He studied the silence between words, the gaps in conversations, the sudden shift of a voice that once was steady. To him, betrayal was not a knife in the back. It was a syllable spoken too casually, and when he caught it, he never forgave. Those who survived under him learned the same rule. Fear the loose tongue more than the gun, because a gun can be dodged, but once words leave a mouth, they cannot be taken back. They travel, they multiply, they grow teeth sharper than steel. It gave him the appearance of paranoia, but really, it was patience. He was not afraid of ghosts, he was afraid of echoes. A single echo could bring soldiers, agents, governments. He had seen it happen to the bold men who strutted too proudly, who let their names become brands, who loved hearing themselves sung in ballads, and he had seen them die because of it. That was the lesson he carried deeper than all the others. That survival was not just about what you did, but about what you never let anyone say about you. He erased himself from conversations before they began. He lived not in rumor but in silence, and in that silence he built something stronger than fear. So when people called him the invisible Godfather, they were not only speaking of his elusiveness in the mountains or the gaps in government files, they were naming his greatest weapon, the discipline to let nothing slip, to let no wrong word pass through the wrong mouth. That is why he lasted. That is why he was never paraded in chains. That is why his story, even now, remains unfinished. The man who never slept did not fear death, or prison, or even betrayal itself. He feared the sound of a name carried on the wind, and because he feared it, he outlived it. Every empire, no matter how carefully it is built, leaves a trail. You can try to cover it with silence, with money, with myths whispered in back rooms, but the ground remembers. And for El Mayo, the shadow of his empire stretches longer than any road his trucks ever traveled. It lies across the mountains of Sinaloa, across the valleys where poppies once bled their red tears, across the border cities where money moved faster than justice ever could. Even when he is unseen, the evidence of him is everywhere. A school in a dusty village that should have closed years ago but still has chalk on its blackboards. A clinic stocked with medicines that somehow never run dry, though the government forgot it long ago. A road that cuts through hills where no state ever paid to pave. People know who made these things possible. They do not speak his name, but they walk his shadow every day. And then there is the other side of that shadow, the blood. Families shattered in the crossfire of wars. He chose not to fight himself, but allowed others to wage in his name. Young men buried with rifles still in their hands, faces blurred in silence, never spoken of again except in corridos that praise them as soldiers of a ghost. Mothers who never knew who pulled the trigger, only that their sons had whispered his name before they disappeared. He understood better than anyone that power was never clean. To hold it, you had to be willing to let blood mark the stones you walked on. His genius was not in avoiding that stain, but in making sure no one could ever prove the footprints belonged to him. Rivals fell, governments bent, shipments flowed, and through it all, his name was always just beyond reach. Present enough to inspire fear, absent enough to escape blame, but shadows do not vanish when the man steps away. They linger, they stretch, they touch places he may never have walked himself. A bribe paid in one town leads to silence in another. A favor given in Sinaloa echoes years later in Chicago. A life spared in Culiacan costs 10 more in Juarez. The lines are invisible, but they are real, and they weave his shadow tighter than any prison wall. People who never met him, who never even knew if he still breathed, lived their whole lives beneath the outline of his choices. Farmers who planted poppies because corn no longer paid. Politicians who stayed quiet when questions burned on their tongues. Journalists who folded their notebooks because one name was too dangerous to print. His empire wrote itself into their lives, not through speeches or monuments, but through the long, dark reach of consequence. Every empire casts a shadow. His just happens to be one you cannot step out of. It has no clear edges, no single source, no statue to topple or palace to storm. It moves with the wind, with the money, with the silence of those who know but do not dare to say. And maybe that is his true legacy. Not the wealth, not the shipments, not even the survival that defied governments and rivals alike, but the fact that long after he is gone, the shadow will remain. It will outlive the man, the myth, and the notebook he may or may not have carried, because shadows are not killed by bullets. They are carried by memory, by silence, by the blood left behind, and so his empire endures, not in the light of day, but in the long darkness cast across a land that still whispers his name. For years, the men and women chasing him have called him many things. Sometimes he is a priority target, sometimes a code name buried in cables, sometimes simply the objective. But inside those agencies, behind the locked doors and the glowing screens, he has become something else, a white whale. The kind of fugitive whose very absence shapes careers, whose ghost keeps men awake long after their shifts are over. The DEA built entire units around him. Case files grew so thick, they had to be split into volumes. Photos of his suspected safe houses were pinned on walls. Maps drawn with red string connecting towns, mountains, and airports. His name appeared in sealed indictments, in testimony, in whispered briefings with congressmen and presidents. And yet, for all of it, there was never a pair of handcuffs on his wrists. Agents retired with him still at large. Some left the hunt bitter, convinced corruption had tied their hands. Others left respectful, almost reverent, as if they had been chasing not a criminal but a ghost who had outplayed them all. Younger agents picked up the chase, bringing new tools, drones, satellites, digital surveillance, algorithms that tracked conversations across continents. Still, the man slipped through. Each time the net closed, he was already gone, and the more he escaped, the larger he grew in their imaginations. They spoke of him in the same way fishermen speak of the monster that snapped the line, the one no one ever actually landed but everyone swears they saw. El Mayo became more than a trafficker. He became a test. If you could catch him, you were not just good, you were legendary. But the chase has always been uneven. He did not need to outgun them. He only needed to outweight them. While agents rotated in and out of assignments, moving families from city to city, his life was constant. The mountains were his shield. His people were his walls. His silence was his weapon. And every year that passed without his capture made him harder to imagine in chains. At conferences, officials still mention him. His file is still passed to fresh hands. His name still hovers in red on screens. Yet there is also a quiet fatigue in those rooms. They know he may die before they ever touch him. They know he may slip away not with a raid but with a final breath in some hidden bed. And if that happens, what will they say? That the white whale drowned them all in silence? Perhaps that is his final victory. To take an entire system built to hunt men like him and turn it into a monument to failure. To remain a ghost so long that he defines the careers of those who never even saw his face. To become not just a target, but a legend written into the margins of their reports. The DEA's white whale. A ghost who was never caught, but who caught them all in his shadow. No one really knows where the line is between retirement and retreat when it comes to a man like him. For some, retirement means a gold watch, a farewell dinner, a house by the sea. For him, if it has happened at all, it would look very different. A safe house in the hills, a circle of guards that has grown smaller, not larger, a voice that rarely speaks, and when it does, it speaks only in whispers. There are those who believe he has stepped back, that after decades of moving weight across continents, after outliving rivals and outsmarting governments, he has finally allowed himself the privilege of age. They say the empire runs on its own now. a machine so well oiled that it does not need his hand on the lever. Others do the work. Others take the risks. He simply watches. Or perhaps he does not even watch. Perhaps he has finally allowed himself to stop caring. But then there are the stories that never die. A shipment that moves smoother than it should. A border crossing that clears like magic. A rival silenced with such precision it feels more like choreography than chaos. And in the spaces between these stories, his name is whispered again, not as a memory, not as a ghost, as the hand that still pulls strings from behind the curtain. Some say he is retired, others say he is reloading. But maybe the truth is that the two things are not so different. To retreat is not to disappear. To wait is not to surrender. He has always understood that silence is not absence, it is strategy. If he has stepped back, it may only be to let others believe he is gone, to lull enemies into lowering their guard, to give governments the illusion of progress, and then, when the time is right, to return with the same patience that kept him alive all these years. In the end, the question may not matter. Whether he has retired or reloaded, the system he built endures. The routes, the bribes, the unwritten rules, they do not stop when his footsteps slow. His shadow is enough to keep them moving. His legend is enough to keep others from straying too far. And maybe that is his greatest trick, to leave everyone asking the same question, year after year. Is he finished, or is he still watching? To turn uncertainty into power, even as age creeps in. To remind the world that sometimes the most dangerous move a man can make is to stop moving at all. Retired or reloading, both answers keep his enemies awake at night. And perhaps that is all he ever wanted. In the world of outlaws, most chase immortality through noise. They want their names sung in corridos, their faces painted on murals, their stories stretched into movies and myths. Fame becomes their second drug, as addictive as the first. But he was different. He wanted none of it. No songs, no slogans, no cult of personality, just silence. And that silence, in the end, is far more terrifying than all the parades of power that came before. Think about it. Pablo Escobar wanted to be remembered. Joaquin Guzman, too, wore his name like a crown even when it brought him down. But El Mayo? He built a legend designed to disappear. A myth that resists fame. A presence felt more in absence than in spectacle. That choice, deliberate and disciplined, is why he remains the one no one has ever truly seen, even as his shadow touches every corner of the trade. He understood what fame costs. Fame makes you visible. Fame paints a target on your chest. Fame invites betrayal, invites agents, invites the very kind of ending he avoided all his life. So he denied it. He stepped away when others leaned forward. He let rivals absorb the spotlight, let them become the poster children of violence, while he stayed in the dim edges where memory blurs. The myth did not spread because he fed it. It spread because he starved it. And that makes him more dangerous, because fame, for all its power, can be dismantled. You can topple statues, you can ban songs, you can capture or kill the men who wanted their faces remembered. But how do you erase silence? How do you fight an image that never existed? A name that is barely spoken, a myth that refuses to stand still long enough to be drawn. There are no shirts with his face on them, no memes that make him a joke, no statues that can be torn down by angry crowds. What remains instead is the unease that someone like him could exist without leaving the marks the world expects. The unease that he could shape decades of history without ever stepping in front of the lens. And maybe that is why his story will linger longer than theirs. Because silence invites imagination. The less you see, the more you wonder. The more you wonder, the more the myth grows. He is not a hero. He is not a martyr. He is not even a memory carved into songs. He is the possibility of a man who never needed any of those things to stay powerful. So when people ask about his legacy, there is no single image, no anthem, no monument. Only a question that feels like a warning. If a man can move whole empires without fame, What else can be built in silence? That is the most terrifying legacy of all. Not the blood, not the money, not the empire, but the proof that you can rule and outlast and even vanish without ever asking the world to remember your name. The night feels lighter now, as if the weight of a name has finally lifted. For so long, he ruled without needing to be seen. A ghost who stitched fear into the fabric of mountains and cities, who bent borders with whispers, who carved an empire not with glory but with absence. Yet every shadow, no matter how long, eventually fades, and his has, too. There are no photographs to mark the moment, no spectacle of chains or mugshots, no dramatic raids played out for cameras, only the quiet certainty that he is no longer here. Maybe he slipped away into age, into silence, into a bed where no soldiers stormed the door. Maybe he became another unmarked grave in a land already full of them. Or maybe he vanished in the only way that suited him, without a sound, without a scene, leaving the world to guess. The government will not parade his body through the streets. The papers will not print his fall in bold letters across front pages. They might not even agree on when it happened. But the story does not need an ending carved in stone. His ending is this: the absence of him, the silence where his name once lived. You can feel it in the air. The tension that once coiled tight in border towns, the whispers that once froze conversations, the dread that lingered in every unfamiliar car on a dirt road, all of it softens now. The ghost is gone, and with his absence comes something rare, something almost forgotten: safety. He was the Godfather who chose invisibility over worship, who let others carry the burden of fame and fall because of it. He lasted longer than anyone else because he never needed the world to see him. But now even his silence has ended. He has joined the ranks of history, no longer a player, just a story told in fragments. So breathe. Let your shoulders drop. The man who never slept cannot touch your sleep anymore. His empire may linger in echoes, his roots may still hum with motion, but he himself is gone. You are safe now, safe enough to let go of his name, safe enough to close your eyes without waiting for footsteps in the dark. Rest comes easier when the Godfather is no longer watching. His shadow no longer stretches across your room. The silence he built is finally yours to keep, not his to control. Sleep now. The story has ended. The ghost has vanished. The Godfather is gone.